In today's video, we gonna talk about some new evidence for Jesus that was just discovered. The crazy thing about this is that historians can't ignore it. And I want to do kind of like a part 2 or an update, if you will. Be respectful in the comments. And if you are not a believer, but you're watching this video, please don't use this opportunity to attack Christians or to attack Christianity. That's not the point of this video. The point of this video is simply to present the facts and let people draw their own conclusions. In fact, he says this about Christians: those who confessed themselves to be Christians were punished. Under no circumstances did they admit the guilt of being citizens of Rome, a most pernicious superstition which had its origin in some obscure and filthy village. However, there's no evidence in the New Testament or anywhere else that Jewish Christians called themselves Christians. He doesn't call Jesus a god, but he says that they worshipped him like a god. So it appears that Pliny understood that early Christians viewed Jesus as divine. And many scholars believe that it was written by someone else and inserted into Josephus' work. However, recent discoveries may prove once and for all that those passages are indeed authentic. They were known as Nazarenes, not Christians, and that this happened during the reign of the Roman Emperor Caligula. Now, again, scholars have debated the authenticity of these passages for years, but with this new evidence, it looks as though it will be hard to deny that Josephus did in fact write these passages. And when they analyzed the text, they found that it indeed contained the authentic voice of Josephus and his actual words. And some people try to use this to argue that Josephus didn't really believe that Jesus was the Christ. He talks about how this man was hated without cause and was finally put to death. Then, after he was put to death, he began to be revered and his followers spread throughout the whole world. He wasn't necessarily agreeing with them, but he was quoting what they called him. These are just a few historians from the 1st century who either mentioned Jesus or believed that he existed. And I didn't even get into the historical evidence for Jesus that exists outside of the Bible. Hopefully this video helped you see that Jesus really is who he said he is. And this makes sense because throughout the rest of the passage, he clearly disagrees with the people who call Jesus the Christ. There are also several other non-biblical sources that mention Jesus and his disciples. So the fact that Marchain believed that this man was greater than Socrates despite being put to death for his belief shows how highly he viewed Jesus, but he was just referring to him that way because that's what people called him. If you enjoyed this video, then please smash that like button down below. Also make sure to share this video with your friends. So recent textual discoveries seem to indicate that Josephus did indeed believe that Jesus was the Messiah. And it turns out that this manuscript dates back to the year 935, which makes it 400 years older than any other manuscript that we have of Josephus' work. The next person that we have to look at is a man named Marabar Serapion. He was a Syrian philosopher who lived during the 1st century. And like the others, he wrote letters, but he also wrote philosophical pieces. What's interesting about this is that Marcion was a philosopher who valued reason above all else. And yet he believed that this man who was unjustly put to death was greater than Socrates. So the fact that Pliny refers to them as Christians indicates that the term Christian was already being used outside of the pages of the New Testament. So it appears that Pliny knew that Christians existed. He knew that they met together in secret, and he even knew that they were persecuted because of their faith, because there is more evidence that has come to light in recent years that scholars simply cannot ignore. Now, many of you have heard of Josephus before, especially if you've heard of the book called The Antiquities of the Jews, which was written by Josephus and translated into English. In that book, there's a passage that seems to indicate that Josephus believed that Jesus was the Messiah. Now, one thing that makes this really interesting is that he uses the word confessed, and that word in Greek is homoousios. And this is significant because that same exact word is used in the Nicene Creed when it says that Jesus is homoousios with the Father, meaning that Jesus and the Father are of the same substance. So this may indicate that early Christians were confessing Jesus' divinity. Again, this is speculation, but it is still interesting that the same word used in the Nicene Creed is also used by Pliny to describe Christians. But first, if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button down below. We would love to have you join our family here. So let's go back to the beginning. Let me explain what's going on here. If you don't know, Pliny the Younger was a Roman governor who lived during the 1st century. He was actually a governor during the time of the Apostle Paul, and he governed the Roman province of Bithynia and Pontus, which was located in what is today modern Turkey. So in the past, I've done videos like this before where I've talked about non-biblical sources that mention Jesus. Now, before we get into it, I would just ask that you keep an open mind. So let's jump right into it. Alright, so let's get started. So the first historian that we're gonna look at is a man named Pliny the Younger. Well, Pliny wrote a letter to the Emperor Trajan, and in that letter he talks about Christians. Now, it seems as though he didn't know much beyond that, but it is still interesting that a Roman governor from that time period knew that Christians existed and was aware of their practices. Now, another thing worth mentioning is that many scholars assume that Pliny was writing about Jewish Christians. Another interesting point that needs to be made here is that Pliny goes on to say that these people worshipped Christ like a god. Alright, so moving on, we have to talk about the Jewish historian Josephus. However, there's a lot of debate about whether or not that passage is authentic. What happened was that in 1978, archaeologists found a fragment of an ancient manuscript that contained parts of Josephus' work. This means that these passages that talk about Jesus are closer to the actual time that Josephus wrote them, which means that it is extremely unlikely that someone would have inserted them into his work 400 years later. Not only that, but he also said that James, the brother of Jesus, was executed by the high priest Ananus ben Ananus. Now, another interesting thing about this manuscript is that it also contains another reference to Jesus. It refers to Jesus as the so-called Christ. However, a better explanation is that Josephus was simply quoting what people call Jesus. Alright, so let's move on to our next historian. And in one of his philosophical pieces, he talks about a man named the Christ, and he compares that man to Socrates. Now, Martian stops short of saying that Jesus was a god, but he clearly viewed him as a great and wise teacher who was unjustly put to death. Socrates was one of the greatest philosophers of all time, but he was never put to death for his beliefs. So there you have it. For example, there are coins that were minted during the time of Jesus that contain images of the high priest Caiaphas, the Roman procurator Pontius Pilate, and even Jesus himself. So the bottom line is this: if historians can't ignore the New Testament, then they can't ignore all this other evidence either. I know that this topic can be confusing sometimes, so I tried to break it down in a way that was easy to understand. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. God bless you. And I'll see you in the next video.